Ladies and gentlemen, John Powell.
Thank you. Thank all of you and thank the Aspen. But I want to thank the poet. My name is John Powell, and I'm the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute. And I flew in yesterday to meet and greet you. And the work of belonging is the work of all of us. And I feel like I have a PowerPoint which I'm going to share with you, but I feel like I should just refer you to the poet. She said it all. So, but since I came all the way from California, I'm going to share some of the PowerPoint with you. Belonging in practice, shaping inclusive systems throughout the world. We'll go back. So the problem of the world, as already demonstrated, is how we other each other, how we suggest to each other that somebody doesn't belong. And when we do that at a national level, at a cultural level, at a village level, it has terrible consequences. So othering, and sometimes othering takes the form of racism, sometimes it takes the form of caste, sometimes it takes the form of who you love or how you love, but it's always deadly, and it's always demeaning. And it's not a problem in one country, it's a problem that's happening all over the world, and I would even say accelerating. So the problem that all of us are facing today is the problem of othering. And these are some of the clever ways we other people. Now, it should be clear. So when we say we don't like someone because of their caste, we don't like someone because of their skin color, we don't like someone because of their language. It's not the person's language or the skin color or the caste. What's really the problem is the othering narrative. Once we assume that some people are not fully deserving, once we assume that some people are less than us, once we assume that we are better than some people, that's the problem. That narrative is the problem. It's not the person that's the problem. It's the way that we respond. It's the way that we create this practice of othering. And sometimes people have multiple things together. So it could be gender, race, religion, language. It's a way of actually restricting people. And it happens to all of us. And sometimes we participate in its happening. So what do we do about it? We practice belonging. We insist that everybody belongs, regardless. It is their birthright. No matter how young, how old, no matter which nation they're part of, we say belonging without othering. Belonging without othering. And it's the without othering that does the work. Because every religion, every moral culture, every nation state creates belonging, but it creates it with othering. So if you're a Christian, it says, if you're a Christian and follow the teachings of the Bible or Christ, you belong. But if you're not a Christian, we have a word for you. We call it a sinner. We say you don't belong. If you're a Muslim, again, if you follow the teachings of Allah and Muhammad, it says you belong. But if you don't follow those teachings, we say you're an infidel and you don't belong, and we can do terrible things to you. I was just in Europe, and as Europe was running around the world, colonizing people, it was saying, we're Europeans, there's something kind of cool about us. But if you're not European, you're not civilized, you're barbarian. And so we created belonging for some, but the expense of was that those who didn't belong were created as the other. And so what we have to move toward, what we've been moving toward, is a world where there is no other, where everyone belongs. That's the practice that we're doing, and we can only do that together. I can't do it, you can't do it, but we can do it. And belonging is different than inclusion. This is a demonstration of that. So if you include someone, you say, as I used the example, I'm going to have a party. You're all invited. You just have to make your way to California. But here's the thing. I grew up in Detroit, so the music is going to be Motown. You're going to hear a lot of Aretha Franklin and Stevie Wonder. I'm vegetarian, so if you like meat, eat before you get there. And I'm older than most of you, so the party ends at 9 o'clock. You're still invited, and you're still a guest, but it's my party. And you might say, no thanks. But what can we do to have our party? Not my party, not your party, but our party. Then we have to figure out what kind of food we're going to have. We have to figure out who's on the guest list. We have to make some accommodations. So inclusion is when you come to somebody else's party. And some of you will be going to work in companies. And you will be more likely than not the guest. And they will tell you, this is how we dress at this company. This is how we behave at this company. This is how we talk at this company. And you're welcome as long as you follow all the rules that you did not make. And you might say, well, can I wear something different? No. You don't get to make the rules. You're a guest. That's inclusion. And it's better than exclusion, maybe. But it's not belonging. Belonging is when you can show up with your full self and you co-create and co-design the rules. And one of the things that I'm finding in terms of this great project that Aspen is doing is that when it comes to different communities, it's a, we have some ideas, but what are your ideas? How do we co-create what we're doing? So that's belonging. So you're already doing belonging. And our goal is to make belonging without othering a global norm. So it's not something in one place, and it will look differently in different countries, in different villages, in different times, because we are constantly co-creating what we mean by belonging. And this concept is an old concept. The concept of belonging is old, really as old as humanity. And these are some words that reflect different ways of talking about belonging. So I've lived in India, I've lived in Africa, I've worked in Latin America, and every place I go, people there have their own expression of belonging. I was telling someone last night that they found an indigenous group that no longer exists. They've been basically extinct. I'm sure there are a few of them still around. And what they found was when they deciphered their language, one of the key phrases in their language was belonging. And so for us to claim this in its myriad expressions from around the world, these are some of your networks. I'm going to go back for a minute. I had a chance to work on the South African Constitution after the end of apartheid. And I had a chance to spend time with Nelson Mandela at his house. And I was talking to one of the Supreme Court justices, Albie Sachs. And I said, Justice Sachs, is belonging in the South African Constitution? He got quiet for a while. I asked him this question in a public meeting like today. He got quiet. And he said, the reason I'm getting quiet, the reason I'm hesitating, is that I'm looking for a phrase that's stronger than absolutely. And he said, Ubuntu, which means I am because you are. It's not just an idea. It's not just a nice saying. He said it's embodied in the South African Constitution. And then he actually told me some cases that he decided where he used the concept of Ubuntu to decide the case. So again, it was just nice to see that the idea is already there. And in terms of coming here, I was looking at, are there expressions here in India, or in Kenya, or in Chile, or in Mexico, or in every place there was. And I have my colleagues here, they're going to be staying longer than me. But we found a group that was organizing already here in India around belonging. So what we're saying is, how do we bring our voices together and make this a global movement that everybody, every place belong? And what is belonging? As we said, belonging means more than inclusion. It also means you're recognized. It means you're seen. It means you have dignity. It means you have respect. And it means you get to co-create and co-design. You're not a guest here on the planet. It is our planet, and we belong to the planet. That's given. And how do we implement belonging so it's not just an idea? And a lot of you have been introduced to the work of equity. And I would say belonging requires equity 2.0, which we call targeted universalism. And I just want to go a little bit down a rabbit hole, as you can follow me. In the United States, the way we practice equity is we compare two groups. We say oftentimes a dominant group, which in racial terms means white people, they have more than black people or Latinos or Asians, generally speaking. And so equity says, how do we close the gap between those two groups? We say equity, fairness, requires that that gap between the two groups close. And that may be appropriate in some cases, but what if the so-called dominant group doesn't have what it needs either to really thrive? I'll give you a concrete example. This is especially true among young people in the United States. For a long time, there was an effort to close the gap between African American males and white males, especially young people, in the area of suicide, because African American males were killing themselves at a much higher rate than their white counterparts. And over the last 10 years, that gap has essentially closed. That is, black men in the United States, so black young people, are killing themselves at about the same rate as white young people. But the gap is closed not because black men are killing themselves less, but because white men are killing themselves more. And when people saw that data, they said, well, that's not what we wanted. We weren't asking that white people kill themselves more. We're asking that black men kill themselves less. I said, that's not what we said. What we said is, let's close the gap. We didn't say how the gap would close. And what we should have said was we want all people to end suicide in every group, not just in white groups, not just in black groups, but all people. And when we talk about all people, that's called something called targeted universalism. Now you'll notice on the diagram that in equity, you're focusing on one group, and you're trying to get that group to that universal goal. And you're not really paying as much attention to the other groups. In targeted universalism and belonging, we're trying to get every group to that universal goal. But it doesn't mean treating everybody the same, because people are situated differently, and so what it takes to actually be effective in one area is not going to be effective in another area. Just to give you a quick concrete example. I have 3 children. So let's say one of my children has strep throat, and another one of my child has an upset stomach. And I go to the doctor, and I said, give me something for strep throat. And the third child is fine. When I get home, I don't divide the medicine up equally between the children. I give the medicine for strep throat to the child that has strep throat. I give the medicine for stomach to the child that has a stomach problem. And I don't give the third child anything. But it's not because I love them differently. It's because they're situated differently. And so what targeted universalism says is that you have universal goals, every child be healthy, but you have targeted strategies based on how people are situated. And so when you look at what's happening with the youth in the world, you have to look at how different groups are situated. How are women or girls situated compared to boys? How are gay and trans youth situated compared to straight ones? How are youth in the South situated compared to youth in the North? So you can't have one plan. You can't have one approach. You have to look and see how each group is situated and take that into account in terms of your interventions. So that's called targeted universalism. But targeted universalism is more than just a program. It's a way to talk to people. It's a communication strategy. Because what you're communicating is that you care about everybody. If everybody's going to belong, then you have to care about everybody. And the way you get to those universal goals, the way you articulate those universal goals, they're co-created. They're not decided by one group. They're not decided by one institution. You say everyone has a role in developing those universal goals. So there needs to be a new way of thinking about how we invest in our future, which is you. I think about this a lot. My children are just starting off in life. And hopefully they have a long life. And I worry about what do we leave for them? How do we invest in them? How do we empower them to actually co-create the future that they will live, that they will inherit? And part of that requires partnerships. They can't do it by themselves. None of us can. How do they relate to their brothers and sisters across the globe? So not speaking or not being heard is a way of being othered. So some people, they think the way you deal with difference is to not notice it. So in the United States, that shows up as, okay, if race is a problem, I won't see race. But that doesn't change things. And in the United States right now, and I don't mean to focus on the United States, but one of the things they say is that we don't want you talking about those hard issues in our classroom. We don't want to talk about race. Sometimes they say we don't want to talk about caste, or we don't want to talk about what happened to indigenous people in Mexico. But not talking about things don't solve them. It's actually silence people. It's saying, not only do I not care about your problem, I don't want you to bring your problem to the table. So we don't want people to be colorblind. We want people to have a voice, people to have the ability to be recognized. You've already heard earlier today about multiple identities, and we all have multiple identities. And those different identities matter. All of us are multiple, all of us. And we have personal identities, we have social identities, we have legal, religious, and so on. I was just in Barcelona, and I met a young woman there who was from Africa. Our family is from Africa. Actually, I said Barcelona. I meant Germany. So I was in Germany. I was in both places. But I met this woman in Germany. And her family had moved to Germany before she was born. So she was born in Germany. But her family was from Africa. I think they were from Senegal. So the Germans have a thing that if you're from Africa, even if you're born in Germany, you're not a citizen. And she said her mom and dad raised her to believe that she belonged. And then as she got older, she wanted to travel. And she didn't have a passport. And the state would not give her a passport. And she was forced to assume a new identity of statelessness, which means that a lot of the resources that we normally take for granted, she didn't have access to. She couldn't come to this conference because she doesn't have a passport. So that's another way of the state saying, you're not fully human. You don't fully belong. You don't get the benefits of other people who do fully belong. Some people are welcome, or some identities are welcome. That's belonging, or it's leaning toward belonging. And some identities are not welcome. And so when part of our identity is not welcome, we feel identity threat. Some of you may know there's a famous writer named James Baldwin in the United States. And when James Baldwin, he'd been writing for years, and finally, this very prestigious writing club said, Mr. Baldwin, we want you to join. We want to recognize that you are a great writer. But there are two caveats. We know you're gay, but we don't want to talk about that. So when you come to this club, please don't remind us that you're gay. He's also African American. And they said, we know you have a lot of rough friends. They aren't welcome. But you are. Just leave your friends at the door. James Baldwin didn't join the club. Instead, he wrote a book. He went to Europe and wrote a book called The Price of the Ticket. And he said the cost of membership was too high. And again, when I was in Europe, there was a young man who talked about being at school. And he grew up in France and proud to be French. And then he said his mom came to school with a hijab covering her face. And he was ashamed. And he realized that to be part of France required that he had to deny his mom and his heritage. And he said he was ashamed of himself because he loved his mom. But the price of the ticket was too high to be really French. So belonging doesn't say to mutilate yourself, to deny your friends, to deny your family, to deny your culture. It says be all of yourself and co-create the world that you need. And how do we do that? We do that through many different mechanisms. One of them are stories. So reality is a very complicated thing. There's subjective reality. How do I feel about something? How does something affect me? There's what people think of as an objective reality. There's reality out there. Something just happened, and we all agree that it happened. There's a third area, which probably most of you are not as familiar with, called intersubjectivity. Intersubjectivity basically means we come together and we agree on reality. Those are all important. But I want to focus on a fourth area, which is meaning. Something happens, and we have to figure out, what does it mean? Is it good or is it bad? Is it something we should get behind or something we should try to stop? Meaning is really where we live most of our life, not an objective or subjective reality, but what does something mean? And stories is how we give things meaning. So stories is the land of meaning making. So part of your job as young leaders, as activists, is to participate in sense making or meaning making. How do you make meaning of things? And what I'm calling upon you is to make meaning in such a way where everyone belongs and no one is other. So think about stories. Who's telling the story? Who is the story about? Who's the audience? And what does it mean? So I want to talk about the audience just for a minute. The audience in the story. We live in a very fractured world. And I'll come back to the meaning of that fracture in a minute. But in a very fractured world, part of your audience is the lizard. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the lizard. The lizard represents a part of the brain. It's the oldest part of the brain. It's also called the amygdala. It's where fear hangs out. It's where anxiety hangs out. And so when we're in a fractured world and people are obsessed with fear, then you need to talk to the lizard. You need to talk to their fear. And what we know is that the fear does not speak the same language as reason. The front of the brain, which is called the prefrontal cortex, is where reason hangs out. The back of the brain, back here, is where the lizard hangs out. We're in a very contentious space where people are very afraid. It's the lizard that's in charge, not the prefrontal cortex. And sometimes we try to reason with people, and they're not being responsive. We show them studies showing that what they're getting ready to do is a terrible thing. But the lizard doesn't read studies. The lizard doesn't read data. The lizard responds to stories. And the lizard is about fear. And so what we do is we have some people who engage in what we call breaking stories, where they activate the fear, and they tell them, you're afraid your life is terrible because of the other. Because that person who may be a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian, somehow they're different than you and they're threatening to you. And then the lizard's going crazy. That's called the breaking story. There's also what's called the bridging story, which is that people may look different than you. They may come to God differently than you. They may eat different food than you. But you share something in common, and you should be curious of each other. They may dance different than you. They may not like Motown. I don't know who that would be, but it's a way we can actually bridge. We can talk to each other. That's called a bridging story. So what I'm calling upon you to engage in are bridging stories, not breaking stories. Stories that connect us, not by making us all the same, but by being curious of each other. And some of you may recognize this is Bob Marley. In one of his songs, he says, every person thinks their burden is the heaviest. Every person thinks that their burden is the heaviest. So I know about my burden, but I don't really know about yours. So part of bridging is for me to learn your suffering as well. And when people suffer, share stories of suffering, and suffer together, it's called compassion. Compassion means to suffer with. So compassion and listening to each other's stories is the way to build bridges. So we talked about breaking and bridging. Just one other thing about the lizard, or two things about the lizard. You don't calm the lizard by saying, don't be afraid. What's the lizard afraid of anyway? What the lizard is most afraid of is not belonging. And so when people say that there's this other that's threatening you, we call these people who are propagating these breaking stories conflict entrepreneurs. They benefit from conflict. They benefit from fighting. They benefit from fracturing. And they say, you got to hate these people because they're trying to take something away from you. They're trying to take your belonging away from you. So if you want to belong here in India or in Chile or in Spain, you got to get rid of these people because they're taking your belonging away from you. Now, the interesting thing about that is that they're still talking about belonging. But they're talking about belonging with othering, not belonging without othering. And their belonging needs the other in order to thrive. So there are long bridges and short bridges. When I introduce people to the idea of bridging, they sometimes think about, well, do I have to bridge with my enemy? There's a guy in the Bay Area, he's a pastor, and he asked the question, he said, John, I hear you say what you say about bridging. But does that mean I have to bridge with the devil? And his name is McBride. I say, Pastor McBride, don't start there. That's a long bridge. For you're a Christian minister, you don't start by trying to bridge with the devil. I said, but also be careful who you call the devil. So start, especially if we're not skilled at this, we're not used to it, start shorter, with a shorter bridge. Start with someone who might share the same faith, someone who might eat the same food, someone who might speak the same language. Might be your cousin. Remember, you know that cousin you haven't talked to for 2 years? Try to bridge with him, her, or they. You already have a lot in common, and so you have a lot to work with. But because the bridge is short doesn't mean it's easy. It just means you have a lot to work with. But then you get to the longer bridges. So the harder bridging, and this is a Zulu word, is sabawanu, which means, translated in different languages, it means I see you. It also means the God in me sees the God in you. Seeing the other person, not just visually, but really seeing them, is the heart of bridging. Being empathetic and listening to another person is the heart of bridging. Now, some people say, but I don't like that person. I don't agree with what they're saying. Bridging is not about agreeing. It doesn't mean you're going to vote the same way. It doesn't mean they're going to even get an invitation to the party. But it does mean you acknowledge their humanity. You acknowledge their suffering. And when you do that, magical things start happening. So that's how you bridge. It's just sabawanu. I see you. And all of us want to be seen. All of us need to be seen, to be recognized for who we are. And sometimes there's so much power differential that it's hard to bridge. So sometimes we have to address that power. So othering. Breaking is a form of othering. But we also can other in terms of how we organize institutions and structures. It's not just interpersonal. So if you're in a building that doesn't have a ramp and a person's in a wheelchair, that person's othered by that design. I had to fly here, and many of you probably had to do the same, and you may have noticed that luggage racks in an airplane are up high. So people who are shorter are being othered by that design. And it turns out that women as a group tend to be shorter than men as a group. And that women as a group tend to have less upper body strength than men. And I often say, and this last statement is somewhat controversial, but I think still largely true, and that is that women as a group tend to carry more luggage than men. So what do women as a group do? Women are more likely to check their luggage, even when they're carrying the same amount of luggage as their male counterpart, than the men. They don't want to be on the plane struggling to get this luggage up over their head, so they check their luggage. What that means is they have to get to the airport 45 minutes earlier than their male counterpart, and they leave the airport 45 minutes later waiting for their luggage, and sometimes they leave without their luggage. What that says is that when you have structures that other us, a personal intervention, you still pay a tax. So we have structures that say you don't belong. Even when you personally try to navigate it, you end up paying the cost for it. So part of that means we have to design structures to belong. And we have to be aware that structures can other. Structures are not neutral. They're doing some work. They're sending a message. And so as you think about what you need to really flourish in society, it might be language. It might be a car. It might be an iPhone or a phone. It depends on each society. But there's some things you need, and there's something others need who are differently situated in order to fully participate in society. So the goal is not just to remove discrimination. The goal is to affirmatively design structures to make sure that everyone belongs. And one of the ways you do that is that everyone participate in designing those structures. My guess is when people built luggage racks in airplanes, women were not present. I don't think people thought, in this case, I say people, I mean men, thought, how do I make sure my wife is uncomfortable if she's flying by herself, right? It just happened. We all have blind spots. So we can other people consciously or unconsciously by not paying attention. We have implicit biases, unconscious biases, and we have structural biases. And when we say biases, it doesn't make someone bad because they have biases. We all have biases. We all have blind spots. We correct those by being in the right relationship with people who are different than us. So at the Othering and Belonging Institute, we have a moonshot. And the moonshot is belonging without othering as a global norm within 15 years, when many of you will be hitting full stride. So we want you to join us in this moonshot to make a world where there's a global norm where everyone belongs without othering. And then I want to ask you, what is your story? And is it about you? And what is your story about us? What is your story about yourself? And what is your story about your community, about your world? Tell those stories. Think about those stories. Share those stories. Can we imagine structures that honor our multiple identities? Can we imagine a world where all belong and no one's other? That's what we're calling for. And we believe you're already doing that work. We're just asking to be more explicit. And we had this beautiful poem calling for this. So if you don't do it based on my presentation, I hope you do it based on hers. But more importantly, based on your own needs. We all need to belong. We're literally brought into the world attached to another human being by the umbilical cord. All of us need each other. So how do we celebrate that and make that real? And if you have time and inclination, I hope you will read my book, written with Stephen Menindee, Belonging Without Othering, and a new one coming out called The Power of Bridging. Thank you.